Hello, everybody. I'm Mark Sachs, ELNET Southeast Regional Director. I'd like to welcome you back to ELNET's Monday briefing. We have a really interesting guest today, interesting conversations ahead of us. I'm going to start with just a little bit of ELNET news, then follow with some headlines that I think will be constructive for today's conversation. Last Wednesday, French President Emmanuel Macron announced France could recognize a Palestinian state at a June UN meeting co-chaired by Saudi Arabia. His announcement was met with an immediate rebuke from high-ranking political and party officials. What once took weeks to mobilize now is virtually immediate. The president of the Senate opposed the move publicly, as did the chair of the Parliamentary Friendship Group in the Senate. He co-authored an op-ed with 103 senators. And the leader of the National Rally Party, Jordan Bardella, said giving the Palestinians a state now would be tantamount to giving Hamas the status of legitimate interlocutor. All of us who work to protect Israel's status in the world, rarely receive a respite, but there are times when we have to acknowledge our work makes a difference. Political and party leaders in France and throughout Europe are standing with Israel like never before, and it's largely because of ELNET's work. The work is only getting more costly, but I've said this before and I'll say it again. The return on your pro-Israel European investment is by far the best return on the entire pro-Israel ecosystem at this time. So I want to thank you for your support. And if you've not yet invested in ELNET's 2025 campaign, please do so as soon as you can. As you'll hear throughout today's discussion, things are going to get tricky and ELNET needs to be there. On to some headlines. First, last Thursday, Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni met with President Trump and his cabinet to discuss bilateral trade between Italy and the US. But her message was much bigger and more powerful than a trade deal between the US and Italy. She made the case for continued and stronger ties between the US and Europe as a whole, pointing out, quote, "I'm here to make the West great again," which should have earned her the sobriquet, the Trump Whisperer, because that charm is just irresistible to President Trump. This is a good sign, because ELNET's raison d'etre has been to align Europe, Israel, and the US around shared interests. And the only way to contest Russia, China, and Iran are in cooperation with a strong Europe, not alone. Also on Thursday, in advance of Saturday's meeting between the US and Iran, Saudi Arabia's defense minister, Prince Khalid bin Salman, visited Iran in the highest level meeting between these two countries in decades. In May, President Trump is set to visit Saudi Arabia. This really makes you wonder what's going on behind the scenes. In 2015, the Saudis, Emiratis, and Bahrainis worked to undermine the JCPOA, and we all remember the drone attacks on Aramco credited to Iran. Now that Iran is weaker and more vulnerable than it's ever been, they are rushing to make nice. And Israel, once the seemingly dominant inside player, now looks to be outside. What gives? Number three, against a backdrop of growing demands to negotiate at all costs for the return of the remaining hostages held by Hamas, Prime Minister Netanyahu gave a televised speech Saturday making his case to continue the fight. There is no imaginable scenario where Israel's red lines and Hamas's red lines meet. This creates a zero-sum game where one must win and the other must lose. So what might this look like? Well, according to reports, the plan appears to be a large-scale military occupation of Gaza. But to do this, Netanyahu will have to convince the public, particularly the reservists who have put their lives on the line, that he has a plan and that his ambitions are strategically necessary, not politically expedient. So the questions then are, what comes next? If and when the Israeli military controls Gaza, will the Saudis, Emiratis, and Bahrainis put their money where their mouths are and demonstrate they actually care about the Palestinians and a safe region? Can Netanyahu pull all this off before the elections? And can he keep Israel cohesive enough, long enough to achieve his goals? We shall see. Finally, on Saturday, the second round of talks between the US, led by Steve Witkoff, and Iran, led by Abbas Araghchi, took place in Rome. The details of a nuclear negotiation can be complex. So a good heuristic is if the Iranians are happy and looking towards a third meeting, you know it's bad news for the West and for Israel. And that's exactly what happened. The changing positions of Steve Witkoff, each correcting a weak statement with a slightly stronger statement, seem to matter little because if reports are correct, the Trump administration has already capitulated to Iran's red line. That is, Iran will be permitted to enrich uranium. Sound familiar? No longer is there a negotiation over whether Iran can or cannot enrich, which was the original US red line under Obama and Trump. Now it's a matter of to what extent and how much Iran can enrich. Anyone with an ounce of skepticism in their body saw this coming months ago, as well as the potential collision course between Trump and Netanyahu. The questions are, where are the E3? Where's the US Congress? Does anyone dare take a stand for a better Iran deal? Well, these headlines are squarely in the wheelhouse of our guest, Danielle Pletka. If you want to get a sense of who Danny is, subscribe to her What the Hell Substack and tune into her What the Hell Happy Hour. You'll find her insightful, irreverent, and sarcastic, which is exactly what you need when studying politics and international affairs. At her day job, Danny is a distinguished senior fellow in foreign and defense policy studies at the American Enterprise Institute, where she focuses on foreign policy, the Middle East, and terrorism. So Danny, it is an absolute pleasure to have you on. Thank you for joining us.
It's a pleasure. It's lovely to be with you all. Thanks for the great work you do.
Thank you. So let's start where I would say is ground zero, just understanding what I would call the Trump doctrine. But I've been struggling to figure out what is the Trump doctrine. So if you could start us off by explaining what you think the Trump doctrine is, and is it working?
I don't think there is a Trump doctrine. If you watched the first Trump administration closely, as I'm sure many of you did, and certainly I did, what you saw was, if you brushed away all the noise, what you saw was a pretty robust foreign policy. Tough on Iran. I would say that Donald Trump deserves the credit for changing the dialogue in the United States about China, reversing the Obama worldview, of the Middle East, which was through the prism of Tehran rather than through the prism of Israel and our traditional Arab allies. And so that's kind of who he was. Yes, he then was critical on our NATO allies as free riders. He talked about our NATO allies owing us money, which of course is not the correct term at all. But at the end of the day, he didn't do anything very drastic, and he was a pretty solid, pretty traditional Republican. This term seems different, as anyone with any money on the stock market can attest. This really is a very unclear administration in terms of ideology, and you'll get a different explanation from every observer. Every newspaper has a different take, every columnist has a different take, every Substack has a different take, and there's a lot of personality-driven politics, right? So, our policy on Ukraine is driven very much by the fact that the president is very angry with Volodymyr Zelensky, correctly, incorrectly. We can debate if you'd like. And on the Middle East, I think a lot of us have been very surprised to see that the president has been pursuing what to many of us looks like Obama Mark II. This is the guy who ripped up the JCPOA. What is he doing now? And why is he giving so much rope to his special envoy, Steve Witkoff, who knows nothing about any of the issues on which he's working? So I don't think there's a doctrine. I think it's very seat of the pants. I think it's very personality based, and I think it is completely day to day.
And we are going to get to Steve Witkoff, don't you worry. So in a What the Hell newsletter, it was from April 8th, titled, "Does Donald Trump Have a Plan?" You wrote, quote, "We've also been trained to take the president, quote, seriously, but not literally. So when he says he's going to bomb Hamas or bomb Iran, or deliver peace between Russia and Ukraine in 24 hours, we put that in our Trump translator and reckon he just means that the given policy is important to him. He's not really planning on bombing Hamas or Iran." And in parentheses, you wrote, "Let's set aside for another post the question of how foreigners read this Trump speak." I'd like to start with that last sentence, because as an organization that works predominantly or almost entirely in Europe, what is your sense that our European allies, how do they deal with this Trump speak?
Not very well. Oh, pardon me. I think there was a big difference in how Donald Trump was greeted in 2016 and in 2024. Pardon me. It's allergy season. Mm. Always at the least felicitous moment, just
Yes,
one terrible cough.
take your time.
Anyway, so in 2016, it was as if everybody in Europe was part of the resist movement in the United States. There were lots of speeches, lots of posturing, lots of denunciations, and those really didn't serve anybody terribly well. They were they could be seen as electioneering at home, right, for our European democratic allies, but they weren't really effective in managing the relationship with the United States. I think there was a very big lesson learned. First of all, a lot of disappointment in Europe with Joe Biden. And I think there was a recognition that, the United States is in a different place than it has been historically. Biden proved that as well. And so what you saw when Donald Trump was elected was, for example, Ursula von der Leyen coming out and making very temperate statements where we welcome Donald Trump, congratulations, we look forward to working with you, and a similar tone from a lot of other leaders. Behind the scenes, however, they're the same. They all suffer from one version of another of Trump derangement syndrome, as we call it here in Washington. And worse to me, and I'll talk about this very much from my perspective. Donald Trump is easily worked with. It's not the same as it is in a traditional relationship, but he is easily worked with. His door is open. He gives everybody a cell phone number, and the Europeans are capable of managing this relationship. The problem is that they have become so used to not managing it and so used to the United States being in the lead and so used to complaining about the United States being in the lead, they've lost this skill set entirely. So where I see Europeans, for example, having a point of view on Iran, right, which should be congenial to the president, they are not using that or manipulating it or offering it in exchange for some other things that they would like. That's how Trump does business. I do this, you do that. And I see them as incapable on this front. I think European ambassadors here in Washington are not very good at this. And I think European governments, barring a few, are not terribly good at this. So, yeah, yes, there's no question that a lot of the things he says and frankly does, particularly on tariffs, are terrible. But how to manage that is not a lesson that anybody in Europe seems to have learned very well.
Are they confused at all by the seriously but not literally part? I think that confuses a lot of Americans. And the way I look at it is that can be used both tactically and strategically. Tactically would be you want to get out of jail free card. You made an error. You say, you took them literally, but you should have just taken them seriously. The other is as a strategy, which is it always keeps your opponent off balance. It makes your opponent feel stupid. They don't understand Trump there, and that's the response. So if you're always keeping your opponents wobbly, then they're not really sure what positions to take or how to do it. Do you think the Europeans are struggling with that?
Um, I think they are struggling with Trump's capriciousness, and I think they rightly see it as capriciousness. I don't think this is a leadership strategy at all. I think this is just seat of the pants, one thing one day, another thing the next. And, as we saw from all of the unbelievably cockamamie deliberations about how to calculate tariff rates, this is something that is not being done in a scientific or methodical way. This is being done, do this, do that, do this, do that. And that's a bad thing for leadership. It's a bad thing for business, very bad economically, but it's also the kind of thing that lends itself to exploitation by adversaries. And this is really what we're seeing with the Iranians now, where the Iranians really are trying to understand and speak the language that they think is being spoken in the White House. And they're good
Mm-hmm.
at that. Now, we all know that the Iranians are extraordinarily good bargainers. It is a cliche, but it's a true cliche, right? That they are bazaris at heart, and that they are very good at this, and that Steve Witkoff, again, bringing up that name, is outmatched by them. So they are the ones who are very cleverly taking advantage. I don't see the same approach by European leaders, and I think that the uncertainty that is being fostered by the White House's pendulum swings back and forth from one policy to another are extraordinarily destabilizing to the Europeans. I also worry that a lot of the assertive statements by the European countries, and again, I'm using the word European as if there is an EU policy, which there isn't, and as if there is such a thing as a Europe writ large, and there really isn't. But forgive the shorthand. But when I look at, for example, the commitments that the Europeans are making towards Kyiv, towards Ukraine, I don't see any real seriousness about what their capacity to shift the balance of that war right now is. And so that's also problematic. We have a Europe that needs to step up but hasn't.
And we'll get to the NATO question as well, because I'm interested in getting your thoughts on NATO and what a reformed NATO would look like in your eyes. But I'm going to go back to Steve Witkoff now, because I want to sort of stay in with the European perception of this administration. Steve Witkoff has made, by my count now, 4 major errors with the Iran negotiations. These are big errors on the big international stage. Before that, you had Adam Boehler, who sacrificed his position for his statements. You've got Witkoff negotiating Putin. He's negotiating Iran, and he's negotiating Hamas. It makes you think that anybody could step in and kind of pick up these files and run with it. It's no big deal. So a similar question: how do our allies and our adversaries look at Steve Witkoff and his team and the administration if this is who's leading the negotiations?
I think they look at it exactly accurately, which is that this is a truly hapless individual. He may be a great guy. I don't know him personally. I know people who know him. I think he's smart, but he's not as smart as he thinks he is. And it doesn't matter how smart you are. You can't do these 3 jobs together. It's not possible. And that, I think, is the challenge here. What it does is it leads you to cut corners. It leads you to say stupid stuff, which Steve Witkoff makes a habit of. It leads you to do stupid stuff, like fly to the Kremlin on your private jet with your girlfriend and not tell anybody about it and not bring a translator and then deal with Putin as if somehow he's dealing with you in good faith. You know, I get that Witkoff really appreciates the power that has been invested in him by the president, but I don't think the president is being well served at all. And I suspect that that is exactly the same view that is held in the National Security Council, in the State Department, in Congress, and everywhere else. The problem is Donald Trump lets him do it. And, look, on the one hand, I want to believe there's a method to this madness. When Jared Kushner was doing this in the first Trump term, and a lot of us were like, Jared Kushner, and Jared was saying terrible things like, oh, well, I've read a few books on the Middle East, as if somehow I mean, does everybody remember that great Holiday Inn Express ad? Are you a brain surgeon? No, but I stayed in a Holiday Inn Express last night. Well, right. That apparently Steve Witkoff only stays in a Holiday Inn Express. I want to believe that there's something deeper, something smarter, something more briefed, something more in tune with what the exigencies of the actual foreign policy threats are. I'm starting to worry that that's not the case. And I think that that concern is shared by Republican leadership on Capitol Hill. I know it's shared on the National Security Council because they were there for the smackdown of Witkoff last week. And I suspect it is shared by poor Marco Rubio, who is nominally our Secretary of State, I guess. Yeah, still maybe.
Which goes back to really my first question, the contradictions in Trump's administration. You have a team of rivals here that couldn't be more disparate in their worldviews. You've Tulsi Gabbard, who now finally people are starting to question the DNI's report on Iran's enrichment capabilities and where they're going. We had on Behnam Bentaleblu from FDD a couple of weeks ago, and we discussed it. I kind of texted him just yesterday and said, we've talked about this 3 weeks ago. Why is everybody only talking about this now? But you have Marco Rubio and Waltz on one side. You've got clearly Vice President Vance and Tulsi Gabbard on the other, trying to figure out who's winning here.
Um, I'm more in tune with who's losing here, and I think that's all of us. I don't care about the conventional critiques. I don't care about what people in foreign affairs say about Trump foreign policy. That doesn't interest me. I'm not especially interested in CNN or even in Fox. What I'm looking at is the results that we're getting. And what I see is that Iran has the upper hand, Putin has the upper hand. I don't think Hamas has the upper hand, but I think that's largely because of Bibi Netanyahu. I don't think that's because of skilled negotiators on our side. And when I look at that, I say we're losing. We're losing, and that's what matters. I don't know how um, the folks you mentioned inside the administration, whether it's the Waltzes or the Rubios or others who are on that hawkish side, are calibrating their response. But I think everybody is being very careful. This is a very, very tough place to work because there are lots and lots of outside players. It's not just the crazy Laura Loomers who can walk into the Oval Office and get people fired. It's also Tucker Carlson, it's also Don Jr., but it's also some good folks who have enormous sway with the president. And so, if you just judge it by the people who you see in the official photograph, a la Kremlinology, you're not going to understand what's going on. And so, look, I see failure. I see failure and disappointment for the president and danger for the United States. But maybe there's a deeper game that I'm not aware of. Inshallah.
You raise an excellent point about the internal maneuverings. H.R. McMaster wrote about it in his book, At War with Ourselves, where he gets into detail all the machinations taking place behind the scenes and having to watch each other's back or watch your own back in that case. So all of this, we're going to get back to Europe now because you would think it's an excellent opportunity for European countries to assert their independence, assert their newfound strength, their position potentially on the global stage. So let's talk about NATO. You've written that on one side, you certainly question some of Donald Trump's positions towards NATO. The cost of having allies is worth it in most cases, I think you'd argue, and with regard to NATO. But as you say, there are a lot of freeloaders, or there were a lot of freeloaders in Europe. And it's essential that there's an opportunity for NATO to reform itself if those people stepped up and increased their defense spending. Talk about that. Who are the pro-NATO people in the administration, and what does a reformed NATO look like to you?
So, I mean, look, again, you're gonna see that there are divisions inside between what I somewhat nastily called the Ronald Reagan versus the Charles Lindbergh wings of the MAGA crowd. And we all know who they are. And you know what? I do think that circumstances change people and they change their positions. And so I hope that in a crisis, we would see a Pete Hegseth, a J.D. Vance step up to the plate and actually show some American leadership. But we're not at that crisis moment right now. Look, NATO, there's an enormous amount of mythology about NATO and an enormous number of cliches that are attached to NATO, right? The greatest alliance in world history is one that you hear a lot about NATO. And those of us who support NATO and who believe in it need to be a little bit honest that that's BS, right? That's rubbish. That's not true. This is not the greatest alliance in world history. This is an alliance that since the end of World War II and since its inception in those years has gone like this. right? Where you've seen investment as a percentage of GDP in defense go from here to here. And the United States has gone to here, but Europe has gone to there. The battle between guns and butter has been won in Europe. It's been won by butter, okay? But butter is not butter, although for a while it was with the mountains of butter. But it is a welfare state, a social safety net that is unmatched globally. It is expenditures on those kinds of things and not on national security. There is, if you want to talk about the problems of NATO, NATO doesn't have interoperability. What does that word mean? It means that, let's say that you were running an operation and you wanted to build this from scratch, right? And you decided to yourself that rather than make everybody have an air force, everybody have an army, everybody have a navy, everybody have certain capabilities, you want to piece those out among different players. If you did that, the answer would be Europe has none of those things. Okay. They don't have enough ammunition. They have no lift, right? They can't take anything that they have anywhere. They have totally disinvested in naval power completely. And the British, oh my God, right? And the only country that has been doing even a little bit, and frankly, we are disinvesting. I think the Trump administration will be disinvesting. Is the United States, and Europe has been free riding on the Reagan era investments in our national defense budget for 4 decades. And we see this, and everybody says, oh, well, the Germans have made an important decision to take their defense budget outside of their national debt break. If everybody followed that, I'm happy to explain it further. I'm sorry, what the hell, right? This is the same Germany, forgive my bad language, but this is the same Germany that was behind Nord Stream 1, which was the Russian export of energy to Europe, Nord Stream 2, which was Russia's effort to bypass Ukraine, cut Ukraine out of a relationship between Russia and Europe. And Germans were instrumental in financing and pushing this for decades. So, that's just the Germans. Forget the French, the Brits. So NATO would be real, right? NATO would do something. I was talking to a foreign leader who shall remain nameless this weekend, and I said, we're talking about the Ukrainians because we're really at a pivotal moment right now. And I said, maybe Europe should remember, and Ukraine should remember how it was that Europe leapt to Poland's defense in 1939 and really saved Poland. Oh, wait. They didn't, right? And we could talk about the Balkans as well, right? Also, the same. We did it. So, this is what is necessary. The problem is the money isn't there, the constituency isn't there, the leadership isn't there. And absent those things, we are not going to have any forward progress.
What do
Sorry,
you make
a rant.
of that's quite all right. It's helpful to understand the perspective. What do you make of Mertz's, the new chancellor for Germany, the large spending bill he received for defense, close to $1 trillion of defense? Europe does have the European Sky Shield initiative, so they are trying to come up with some form of interoperable air defense system. 22 countries are aligned. Is that moving in the direction that you're sparking? So do you not buy it, or is there something more you'd like to see?
No, I think the problem there is not the problem is not the spending bill. That's great. I think the change in the debt break was great. I think any attempt at European interoperability and national continental defense is a great thing. But you're starting from an incredibly bad baseline. And let's also recognize what is prompting Europe to do this. It's Donald Trump, right? What happens when Donald Trump goes away, which he will? What happens when the European leaders need to actually persuade their people that this is important? I pointed in one of my recent Substack to a Pew survey that was done in 2015, so quite a while ago, but it was obviously in the aftermath of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and the subsequent annexation of Crimea. profound concerns about what was going to happen. Remember, Barack Obama was no friend of Europe, no friend of any, notwithstanding protestations to the contrary. And what did they do? Almost nothing. What did the European people polled? Six different countries were polled. Again, you can cut down the poll, but it was revealing. Not only were European nations not interested in coming to Ukraine's defense, they weren't interested in coming to their own defense. Right? This is what, and if anybody can persuade me that there has been a sea change and that young men and women of military age in, I don't know, Europe, Italy, France, Germany would be willing to actually join the military to protect their country, I'd be A, gobsmacked, B, delighted, and C, gobsmacked again.
That seems to be a trend across all Western democracies. The poll also included the United States, which suffered from the same lackadaisical attitude. I don't know if lackadaisical is the right word. More like I get the hell out of here
Yeah,
attitude from a
right,
lot of young people today. Right.
right, because
So,
leadership matters. Leadership
yeah.
matters, period.
So,
It does.
so all that raises a question about Pax Americana. Neil Ferguson has been writing about this quite a bit lately, and his position is that you could see the end of Pax Americana for quite some time, but it's more than just the U.S. backing away militarily. There's something about Pax Americana that the world is terribly going to miss if we continue to back off the international stage. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, that's 100% correct. The problem is that, you know, um, I don't know what our average age is on this this particular broadcast, but my guess is it's somewhat older than the average age in America because that's who tunes into such things. And we know, right? We remember what it was like when the world was much less stable. Okay, and this is what I try to tell students. Whenever I have them, and I teach at Georgetown, but I try to tell student groups at AEI as well. But now it's not just students, really. It's everybody after Gen X. The answer is there is another world out there, right? There is another world that is not governed under the Pax Americana. The world in which I grew up, where, when my colleagues, my classmates went off to do their junior year abroad, they didn't go to Siberia or Nanjing or deepest Africa or Argentina. They didn't even go to Spain, right? Because it was not safe, let alone think about going to Portugal or anywhere else. They went where they speak French and Spanish and German, basically, and that's it, right? The world that was built in the aftermath of the Cold War and during the Cold War was built under the umbrella of American leadership, and it is everything. It absolutely everything, whether it is people's cell phones or people's bank accounts or people's cash machines or people's student abroad or the lack of wars or the lack of deaths in wars, all of those things, right? Freedom of commerce, the rise of of China I'm sorry, inside the global trading system. All those things were thanks to the United States, and they can go away. And people don't recognize that that's a possibility because they never lived in that world and they are historically ignorant. And it's exactly right that as Neil says, that you can just that can disappear. And nature abhors a vacuum. It will not be good guys who pour into it, right? It'll be the Russians, it'll be the Chinese, it'll be the bad guys because they have the will to power where apparently we and the Europeans will not.
The jungle always grows back.
That's
So
right.
we discussed a little bit about Europe, but I'd still like to get your thoughts. If you were advising leaders in Europe, advising Israel and Taiwan, all of whom, as you just said, benefited enormously from Pax Americana, what should they be planning right now? What should they be thinking? What policies should they be considering? What actions should they be taking right now with the view that Pax Americana may be receding for this foreseeable future?
Right. Well, I mean, the most straightforward is the discussion we had on our podcast last week with Elliot Abrams about what we should do about Iran, right? And the answer is Israel should bomb Iran. Iran will not be this weak for long. They are extraordinarily weak. Their air defenses are decimated. Their allies are either gone or unbelievably weakened. Everybody is afraid. Now is the moment for the Israelis to undertake that. There's too much public debate about what would happen and what would it be like and what would this happen. Do it. Donald Trump doesn't want to help. Donald Trump won't help. That's the discussion that's going on right now, and we are being manipulated in this discussion by the Trump administration, which leaked that the Israelis were looking to hit Iran in May, and that the Trump administration said no. So the answer is that they should deal with their adversaries while they can. For the Taiwanese, my great disappointment is that the Taiwanese do not do enough in their own self-defense. Part of it is the divided nature of their democratic governance. Part of it is their hope that tomorrow will look like yesterday. The reality, as my colleagues at AEI who know much, much more about this than I do suggest, is that China remains persuaded that it will be able to win Taiwan without military conflict, that in fact it will be able to pull a Hong Kong on Taiwan. And they may not be wrong. This is something that if Taiwan doesn't want this, if the Taiwanese people don't want to be like the people of Hong Kong, and I would assume that they don't, having been quasi-independent all these years now, they need to do something about that. They need to up the size of their military. They need to invest more in their military. They need to buy more, and they need to be more aggressive on the global diplomatic stage, which they are not. And they need to be players all over. These are huge challenges, and countries and leaders need to stand up for themselves and hope that their leadership infects the United States with a desire to do the right thing as well.
I'm glad you jumped to China. We're going to go to China with a question, then I'm going to go back to Israel, Iran, and Trump, because I think that creates a very interesting dynamic. So I've heard different explanations for this question that I'm going to ask you. Now you had said, and one of the explanations for, well, let me say the question, and then we'll get the explanation. So I had asked someone if China wanted to, they could, in essence, call Trump's bluff, probably ruin his presidency, and take control if they just made a move on Taiwan right now. Um, Trump's all over the place. He's anti-war. That would force him into a military conflict. It would set a whole bunch of things in motion that I don't believe the administration is ready for. One response I got from that was what you had just mentioned, which is why China doesn't need to do that. They could just wait out Trump because they think they can take it from the inside out. Um, but others have said if you push China too far, particularly with the trade and the tariffs right now, the way to unwind that almost immediately seems to be for China to take control. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I don't think that's very logical. Look, the Chinese need the global trading system for their own economy. Their economy is entirely export dependent. And so the idea that they would unite everybody behind the United States in trying to isolate them and build an economic wall around them seems to me to be absolutely terrible strategery, as George Bush might have said. That doesn't work, and that to me is not the pathway forward. Now, again, no one is on Team China, right? Russia is on Team China. Iran is on Team China. None of the good guys are on Team China. And that worm has turned. And so I don't think that Donald Trump is changing attitudes towards China in what he's doing with tariffs. What he is doing, however, is if Xi Jinping plays this intelligently, he is providing opportunities to China to create global trading relationships that cut out the United States. And that's how should I say this in the best think tanky way? That's dumb, right? That's stupid, and that's not the only stupid thing about his tariff policy, but it is one of them. So I don't think that we are goading the Chinese into anything. And I think again, the Chinese are never going to try to achieve what they want militarily if they think they can get it another way, right? The
Mhm.
cost of what they've done in Hong Kong has been basically zero to them. And that is what they would like to replicate in Taiwan. I hope that the cost to them of doing anything in Taiwan would be hugely high. That's not the direction that things are headed, however.
Okay. All right. Fair enough. Thank you for that clarification. Let's get back to Iran and Trump, and Bibi. Trump doesn't like people to defy him. Um, and Netanyahu has said pretty forthrightly they are not going to allow Iran to obtain nuclear weapons capabilities, which puts him and Trump at odds. If Israel were to take action, what do you think the fallout would be?
First, I'd like to be persuaded that Israel is going to take action, and I'm not persuaded of that. Every single prime minister, including Bibi, in every iteration of his leadership, and all of the other parties have all said, we're never going to let Iran have a nuclear weapon. We're not going to let Iran have a nuclear weapon. But we should go back and see what it was they said before that, which was that we're never going to allow Iran to have enrichment, right? That's not true. Iran has enrichment. We're not going to allow Iran to reprocess. No, that's not true. Iran reprocesses. We're not going to allow Iran to have, advanced centrifuges. That's not true. They do. There have been over the last 30 years that this has been central to Israeli policy. Starting in around 95, there have been any number of red lines laid down by both the Israelis, the United States, the Europeans, and the United Nations. All of them have been crossed. And so for me, the idea that Israel, quote, isn't going to allow seems to me to be kind of rich. I'd love to have that proven to me. I don't know what it is that Benjamin Netanyahu thinks that he is going to do to stop it. He has missed every window of opportunity and looks like he may well be on track to miss another one right now. So, that's the challenge here. The Iranians, and I'm sure that Behnam said exactly the same thing to you. They are not going to give up their nuclear weapons program. Why? Because they're not stupid. Okay? They don't want to be part of the global community, what we're dangling out there for them. They don't want to be part of the community of civilized nations. That is not the aim of the Islamic Republic of Iran. The aim of the Islamic Republic of Iran is number one, number two, and number three, regime protection. Okay. Look at the
Mhm.
guys who gave up nuclear weapons. People keep saying, look, the Libya model would be so great. And the Iranians look at the Libya model and say, oh, yeah, that was a great decision by Muammar Gaddafi. Where is he now? Oh, yeah, he was shot in the back of a truck. Right. How about Ukraine? They gave up their nuclear weapons. Was that a good choice for them? Hmm. So they can go one after the other, and for them, the idea that they should give this up in order to somehow get out from under is not right. And the problem is that that is the premise of this dialogue that's going on now, and that has gone on for the last 20 years. Right? They're not going to give it up.
And
And I
from
don't know what
reports,
the
there
Israelis
seems,
are.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I said, and I don't know what the Israelis are going to do about it because they have not shown themselves to be terribly determined.
And from the reports, there doesn't seem to be much discussion about ballistic missiles, about weaponization, about proxies, all the other things that would manifest a good deal are not being discussed in any way, at least at this stage. Yeah, negotiations are about power and overcoming another's red lines. And we seem to be completely unwilling to figure out how to articulate a message that gets the Iranian regime to move off their red line. And as you said, I think it all hinges on the regime's longevity. So the regime can survive or not survive in one of two ways: either survive and negotiate and get off your red line, or the regime doesn't survive. That would seem to be the way to negotiate with the Iranian regime, but it doesn't seem to be on the table.
Nope, it
Which
doesn't.
leaves the Europeans, who have the final straw with the snapback sanctions, which sunset on October. Want to wager a bet whether or not the Europeans, the E3, use that lever? Is there a possibility?
So I think they've effectively made the decision, or they had, as of last week, made the decision to go with snapback. Then the Iranians got their hook into Steve Witkoff's mouth, and I now worry that the Iranians are going to slow roll the process to the point where snapback is no longer an option. They're very good at it. They're very serious about how to maneuver around the exigencies of the West, and they are very shrewd at hiding their nuclear weapons program. So, I'm not persuaded that we are cognizant of every element of their program. In fact, every single advancement that they've made has been a surprise to our intelligence
Mhm.
community. So I'm not I'm not confident that we know what the full scope of their actions is. I'm not confident that we have a solid set of asks in order to get them in the right direction, as you suggested. And I think they are in the lead. I think they're winning this hands down. And that is troubling. So if I had to make a bet on snapback, last week I would have said 65, 70% snapback is going to happen. This week I'd say it's down to 50-50.
So I'm going to ask one more question. I'd like to remind everybody, if you have a question, please submit them, and I will read them off to Danny. So Danny, what should our policies be? That is ELNET. ELNET. We've got 6 offices in Europe, the major capitals. We're constantly working with political leaders, policy influencers. What message should we be taking from your perspective to European capitals all across Europe, whether, with regard to, well, particularly with regard to Iran, but if you want to talk about Israel, Europe, where do you see these policies aligning between them? What policies do you recommend we take to them?
Look, the biggest threat um, to us, to you, and to Israel's relationship in Europe has very little to do with Israel, very little to do with Hamas, and everything to do with the changing nature of the population inside Europe. And we are now looking, I'm from Australia. There are about 100,000 Jews in Australia. There are 800,000 Muslims. Now, not all Muslims are anti-Semites, anti-Israel, pro-Hamas, and not all Jews are pro-Israel or interested in any of this. And not all pro-Israel players are Jews. So, it's certainly not in the United States. That being said, however, the idea that things are changing, there are the people who come to these demonstrations that we are seeing regularly in the streets of Amsterdam, Paris, and London. These are not foreigners. These are people who live in these countries, and so solidifying working on questions of anti-Semitism, of anti-Israel behavior, of and on assimilation, frankly, into understanding values, understanding democracy, understanding civil and religious freedoms. Those things are critical because if those things don't happen, and I find distasteful, frankly, all of these, the apocalypse is coming, London has fallen. A friend of mine put that headline on their recent piece. But we are moving in that direction. And at that point, it won't be a question of what do we need to do to get European countries to share our priorities of supporting Israel, supporting democracy in the Middle East. It will be a question of what are we going to be able to do to save people like us in these countries. And that to me is one of the most concerning things where I see lots of criticism. I see lots of political posturing by, the European right and the European far right. What I don't see is a lot of really effective organization to make these things really, really salient political issues inside the EU and inside Europe. There's much more advocacy for a Syrian who supports Hamas staying in, Italy or in the UK or in France, than there is for the idea that actually this is not a tolerable situation at all. So that's when I think about Europe and these issues, that's what I think about. The foundation is crumbling.
Yeah, you raise an important cultural phenomenon that's taking place, predominantly in Western Europe and in this country as well. What's interesting is, in the UK, the Muslim population is 8%. High, but not as high as one would think, which means that the balance of that far left is made up of the Red Party, the Red Green Alliance. The Green Party in this case is only 8%, so you're dealing with a whole cultural change or component in the British society, much like ours, where you have the far left aligning with the Muslims, and so, or let's say the Islamists. I don't want to say Muslims. I'll say the Islamists, and that is somewhat outside. Let's say it's concerning to Jews, but Jews are a small component of that larger cultural challenge that Western societies are dealing with, namely the survival of democracy, law, respect of other cultures, things like that. And thankfully, we are across Europe doing things combating anti-Semitism. We've got a large anti-Semitism summit in Vienna held every year. We are behind the implementation of Poland's anti-Semitism strategy. So we are recognizing a lot of these cultural changes, and we're heavily involved in the UK, France, Berlin. But this is a challenge I think all those who respect and love democracy are paying attention to, certainly in this country. And in this country, Islamists make up Muslims make up 2%, Islamists slightly less. And we've seen the challenge that we've had in this country. So all Western countries are dealing with it.
Exactly.
I'm going to welcome Tom Flesch to say a few words, and then I will close. But Danny, I want to say thank you very much. This was far-ranging, really interesting, and I've loved having you on.
It's my pleasure. Great questions. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Hi, Tom. Floor is yours.
Right. Thank you, Marcus. Good interview. And Danielle or Danny, I don't know which you prefer, but I'm speaking to you. It's a wealth of knowledge that you bring from your experience. Years and years I read before I came on today about your experience, and we're really delighted to have you and have your insights. Although, as a result of this conversation today, I think I feel more uncomfortable than comfortable. And in particular, you spoke about NATO. Does NATO serve as a deterrent anymore? And if it does, to whom? Then if it doesn't, why is there usually such conversation about trying to bring in other European countries into the NATO organization, the umbrella of NATO? It seems like there must be some deterrent left for the NATO alliance. And I don't know the answer to that.
Well, of course, NATO remains a deterrent because a decision to act by NATO still brings with it some weight, particularly if all of NATO acts as one. The problem for NATO is that Vladimir Putin has very successfully operationalized an effort to pick NATO apart. And what he does is he doesn't challenge NATO frontally. What he does is that he uses various players, including the President of the United States, to challenge various questions. So what'll happen is that if in fact we see a solution to the Russia-Ukraine war this week, as is being negotiated in London on Wednesday, maybe what we will see at some point not too far down the road is Putin making an effort to destabilize the Baltics. And these are countries that are in NATO. They are countries that have substantial Russian-speaking populations, and he's going to wait and see whether whether NATO responds. So he's going to test us. And it will be very interesting to see what the response is, because I worry that it's not just the United States that won't step up. You know, Europe was not willing to step up for Ukraine in any serious way until it looked like we were going to step back. Now, again, much more than the president has suggested. But so, you know, NATO remains a formidable idea, but Putin has very strategically and very cleverly worked to fray the threads that bind us. And I'm not at all confident that that we will last into the future if there is not a shared effort to invest, educate, and lead.
Yeah, I'm just concerned that, you know, the old phrase, good will prevail. It depends if you're dealing with reasonable people and reasonable ideologies. And I think that the might, as you mentioned, and the muscle is more influencing. And I do feel in democracies and our systems that it stands for good and opportunity. So we're hopeful to see what happens. You mentioned since the war that we've seen basically stable lives, pretty good times with democracies. But I just know even my children who are in business, they've, you know, and they're in their 30s and young 40s, they've essentially only seen good times and good economies. And they got wake-up calls in 2008 and last week with the drop. And the reality is that things can change very quickly, and really must be prepared to anticipate that it could happen. And that's why I really enjoyed what you had to say, because you're looking forward and you're saying what, in your opinion, which I agree with, what the realities are and what the risks are. And speaking about that, I don't know if you know about our convention, our conference, I should say, that's coming up in Paris, in beautiful city, maybe one of the most beautiful, well, it depends on who you ask, but I know for sure if you ask Aryeh, that Paris is the most beautiful city in the world, and we love it. And there's going to be a beautiful, well-organized conference there. It'll be May 18th through the 20th. And we have a lineup of speakers. I think probably one of the best lineups of speakers that I can recall. And it'll be very informative. There is time to still enroll. I think Randy's going to put a message here how you can enroll if you're interested. The initial phase has been sold out, but there's still room. And we hope that our listeners will come. If you haven't enrolled, there's still time to do so. And more importantly, and I say this from my heart, I am a child of Holocaust survivors, as is my wife. And I know what equal playing field, I know what democracy, opportunity, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It's in the Torah, it's in the United States Constitution about enjoyment and happiness. And so I hope that those values will prevail, and we're doing everything we can in our might at ELNET and FELNET to promote those values. But we also cannot be naive to think that people don't want it. There's people that are against our prosperity. And whether it's envy, jealousy, or ideology, we want our place on this earth too. So thank you for what you do. I hope we see you again. And to all our listeners that support us, and all the support is growing. I have to say that we are sometimes even overwhelmed, but our staff is growing. We are reaching out all over the United States with our offices, and we opened some additional offices in Europe because we're responding to a demand, and there's interest in what we're doing, and they want to promote the relationships. So I hope that we have a bright future. I hope we'll continue to make the headway, and I want to say thank you because you're doing a lot to help us do that. So thank you to you, and thank you to everybody that supports us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you.
Thanks for
All right,
everything you all
everybody.
do.
Thank you, Danny. It's great having you. Thank you, everybody. Enjoy your day.